Why is it when it comes to seeing others' faults, we have 20/20 vision, but in seeing our own faults, we are decidedly short-sighted? A man wrote into a columnist in the paper, and he had this to say. He said, driving to the office this morning in the other lane on the highway, I noticed this crazy woman driving 65 miles per hour with her face up next to her rearview mirror, putting on her eyeliner. I looked away, and the next thing you know, she was halfway in my lane, still putting on her makeup. Now, as a man, he wrote, I don't scare easily. But she scared me so much, I dropped my electric shaver, which knocked the donut out of my other hand. And in all the confusion of trying to straighten out the car using my knees against the steering wheel, it knocked my cell phone away from my ear, which fell into the coffee between my legs and ruined my phone, soaked my trousers, and disconnected a very important call, all because of that reckless woman driver. Have you noticed this about human nature? When admitting something bad about oneself, the capacity to focus blame on others is infinite. Isn't it amazing how we are able to pick apart precisely what is wrong with someone else and what it is they need to shape up, yet excuse our own wrongdoing? Well, Jesus speaks to that very issue in our passage this morning. We return to the greatest sermon ever, the Sermon on the Mount, and we come to the final chapter in Jesus' sermon, Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7. I invite you to turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 7 this morning as we unpack what is in front of us in the first 6 verses. For the next 4 weeks, as we conclude the Sermon on the Mount, we'll be looking at Matthew 7. This morning, it's the first 6 verses. Now, Jesus here uses humor to speak to a very serious matter to get his point across. He talks about planks, specks, pigs, and pearls. And the window into Jesus' heart from this portion of this sermon speaks to how we are to view others. Jesus masterfully peels away the layer of the onion and exposes the inaccuracy of our self-perception, and what we see in others can often be wrong. Well, let's first look at a first heading, the world's most popular Bible verse. The world's most popular Bible verse. Matthew 7, verse 1, Jesus says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged." Now, perhaps more than any other verse in Scripture, this verse right here is the most misapplied and misused. It is a verse most quoted even among people who are not Christians. It is one verse many people have memorized. And people like to use it when they can, especially when they're being called out for something. It is the go-to verse to escape any kind of moral accountability. It's a popular verse. It's a verse people like. So it kind of goes like this. You know, I haven't seen you in church for 2 months. Do not judge. You know, you really shouldn't be spending that time with that other woman who's not your wife. Do not judge. You know, your language is offensive. Your drinking's out of control. Your time away from family is detrimental. Your neglect of your health is not good. Do not judge. I mean, you can see how this could be terribly misapplied. It gets to the place of absurdity. Son, I want you to clean your room. It's a mess. Do not judge. Statement's given a D. A student is given a D for a paper poorly written. Do not judge. A thief, when caught stealing, do not judge, or you too will be judged. You can see why it's such a popular verse. It's popular for the wrong reasons. It's a misapplication of this verse to suggest that no one can ever speak to a wrongful action in someone else's life. That's misapplication. Because as we've seen throughout this greatest sermon ever, there is a right and there is a wrong. And throwing around this verse as an escape clause for wrong, sinful behavior misses Jesus' point. It is popular in its wrong use of it. You know, another way it's often misapplied is when it comes to criticism. How often have you heard, or perhaps even said yourself, something to the effect of, well, you're not perfect either. Oh, excuse me, Mr. Perfect. Excuse me, holier than thou. Oh, yeah, like you're the one to talk. Right? Have you ever said any of those or heard it said? And am I the only one, when confronted with a wrong, say by your spouse, turn the tables of that conversation around and say, well, you know, since we're talking about faults here, there's something I want to point out that you always do. Am I the only one? Come on. Don't leave me hanging here. You know, there's so many wrong reasons for liking this verse. So how are we to properly apply these words? Because without any qualifiers, Jesus forbids judging. What is Jesus' point? Well, as we work our way through these verses this morning, it should be clear that the takeaway for us is self-evaluation, self-awareness. See, this passage isn't about some escape clause. It is a mirror for us to look into to see our own faults. That's where Jesus is going with us. It's a mirror. As someone put it, the best place to criticize your neighbor is in front of the mirror. See, the issue Jesus is addressing is a judgmental attitude. It's to be hypercritical of others while ignoring our own need of grace. It is holding a standard over others that we wouldn't want held over us. And that's really what he comes to in verse 2, the second heading. What if we really aren't the standard? What if we really aren't the standard? What does Jesus say to the person who judges? Verse 2, Jesus says, for in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Now, I don't know about you, but that really ought to slow us down in the area of judging. Harsh judgment and sharp criticism of others is like this boomerang. It's going to come back on us in return. In what way are we in danger of receiving the same kind of judgment that we give to others? Now, if we think of these words here on a horizontal level and in our relationship with others, then how I treat others is instructing them on how to treat me. Did you hear that? How we treat others is instructing them on how to treat me. See, the measuring cup we use is the same measuring cup others will use. If we kind of think of this for a moment on the horizontal level. If we give out critical evaluation or harsh criticism or quick assessing without having all the information, then in the same way we will be measured by others. You know, that begs the question. The scrutiny you use in judging others, are you prepared to live under that arrangement yourself? I think we need to probe a little deeper. Because I think the matter that Jesus is poking at is our reference point for judging. What is the source of judgmentalism? Doesn't it come from the notion that we are the standard? See, we might be good at something, so everyone should be good at that too. What's their problem? If you're strong in meeting people and you're kind of outgoing and you're very personable, then you can start to judge someone who isn't the same way, right? We all do that. If you have strengths, for example, in the area of mercy, then you judge those who might lack mercy in some given situation. You kind of just throw up your hand and say, what's wrong with them? Why don't they care for people like I do? Why aren't they as involved as I am? I mean, I show up early for practice. I'm in Bible studies. I'm in 2 Bible studies a week. I have 3 kids at home and still attended the women's event. What's everyone else's problem? I'm the standard. But what if we really aren't the standard? What if you really aren't the reference point? Consider a vertical reference point. Consider that God is the standard. God is the judge. He is the one to whom we all must give an account. Him. And we see God as the reference point. It changes everything. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 13. It says, nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of Him to whom we must give an account. Romans chapter 14, an entire chapter devoted to judgmentalism in the church. Paul says in verse 10 of Romans 14, he says, you then, why do you judge your brother? Why do you look down on your brother? For we all stand before God's judgment seat. And in verse 12 of the same chapter, he says, so then each of us will give an account of himself to God. You see, when we view God as being over our life and the one to whom we must give an account, it ought to transform our view of others. It really should. I mean, do we really want God to judge us by the same standard we use on others? Do we really want God to judge us by the same standard we use on others? And can't we all agree that our judgments of others are often based on limited information? The problem with judging is that we are pretending to know all that there is to know about a person and a situation. Now, I really wish I didn't have a recent personal illustration of this, but I do. Last Sunday, I was away with the family in upstate New York, and I visited this church that I had heard about while I was pastoring in New York, 40 minutes away, but I had never before now had visited this church. I'd never visited this mega church, but I had definitely formed some opinions of that church. You know what I mean? I had it all in categories. I figured it out, what they were all about. Never visited it. So I walked in with two judgments. One is that the preaching would be shallow, watered down, and a feel-good kind of message. That was the judgment I had made. Never been there before. The second judgment I had made was that the worship band would be showy and more of a performance. And so as the band moved into leading the first song, it was very loud and lights were dimmed, and the worship leader, a young girl, offered a couple of opening comments, and she then led out vocally in song. And over to my left, very close to me, was her fan club. What I mean by that is that the young people in that section over to my left, they were hooting and hollering the worship leader's name and cheering her on as she gave some thoughts, as she led out vocally, and I went, just as I suspected. I had made judgments, and then I looked for evidence to support my case. Ever done that? Ever made judgments, and then you look for evidence to support that? That's what I was doing. I assumed the worst and formed opinions on limited information. Now, after a couple of songs, the youth pastor got up to give some announcements, but before he gave his announcements, he began by saying, I am very proud of Kayla, who is the worship leader. Just a few years ago, he shared, she showed up to youth group not knowing anyone. She was a lonely teenager trying to find her way, and here she is today for the very first time leading worship. And I thought, did he read my mind? That gave it some context, right? Did this youth pastor know what I was thinking? How was it that he exposed my judgmental spirit? I was humbled. And while I still prefer what we do here, my critical spirit judged a young lady whose life had been transformed by the Lord Jesus Christ. Oh, and the preaching, by the way, rock solid. Nothing watered down there. I was wrong. It's been said, it's easier to be critical than to be correct. It's easier to be critical than to be correct. Because really, how much skill does it take to be critical? Yet how often have I made a judgment about someone based on limited information? If only I knew the backstory. If only I took the time to consider what else might be going on in this person's life. Philo of Alexandria put it this way. He said, be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a great battle. And I thought, wow, if only we could have this perspective within the Christian community. I mean, do I really know what is going on in that single mom as she's and passes judgment on this single mom on how she's handling her kids? Do I really have a clue what it's like? Do I really know what's going on with that person who doesn't seem to smile? Do I really know what you might be going through as you walk through those doors on a Sunday morning over your teenager, troubled teenager, or your college daughter, or your aging parents, or your boss at work, or your employment? Do I really know? Or the pain of some loss in your life? Do I really know as you walk through the doors the struggle you had to even get up this morning? It's been said, do not judge another until you've walked a mile in their shoes. Steve Martin added, he said, never judge a man unless you've walked a mile in his shoes. Then you'll be a mile away and you'll have his shoes. Well, that's not exactly where we're supposed to go with that one. But I liked it. See, as we've seen throughout this sermon series, Jesus peels us away from looking at the externals to looking at what's going on inside. It's not helpful to judge others based on external appearances. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. I am not the standard, and neither are you. God is the standard. And Jesus says simply, do not judge. And then he uses some humor here as he speaks of planks and specks. Third heading, being judgmental actually is laughable. Being judgmental is actually laughable. It's ludicrous. Look at verse 3. Jesus says, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? Verse 5, you hypocrites! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Now, a speck, by the way, could be a small stalk or a twig, or possibly something as small as a splinter. To have something in our eye, no matter how small it might be, is significant. Sometimes the smallest eyelash becomes an irritant that must be removed, right? So you can't just walk around the day with that. So where there's a speck, it needs to be removed. So the problem isn't with the speck, per se, in this context. I mean, there is a speck, a sin that might be hindering the running of the race. There are times when that sin, that blind spot, that area in our lives is hurting our interactions with people, that we need the help of others to see it. See, this is not saying that the speck is incidental. See, the problem is with plankinitis. Do you have plankinitis? Do you know what plankinitis is? Well, someone actually took the time to give a definition of plankinitis. It wasn't me. Got it from somebody. You won't find it in Webster's. But he said, plankinitis, I like this, a disease that distorts self-perception and renders an individual incapable of recognizing personal faults. It occurs worldwide. And this is how laughable being judgmental is. See, a person enters into a room with a 2x4 bulging out of his eye. Just kind of imagine that, as far as you want to go with it, without getting too graphic. But he has this 2x4 bulging out of his eye. He goes into a room, and he looks across the room, and he sees a speck of sawdust in somebody else's eye. So he starts to walk across the room through the crowd of people, banging into people with his 2x4 that's sticking out of his eye. And he finally gets to this person who has the speck, and he can't even quite reach him because the plank is bumping into the person right there with the speck in his eye, and it's hitting him. And the one with the 2x4 protruding from his eye, he says, "You know, brother, I'm not sure you know this or not, but you have a speck of sawdust in your eye. Let me help you remove it, because I'm an expert in removing things from the eye." Really? You talk about denial. I came across this quote. It's not denial. I'm just selective about the reality I accept. You have plankinitis. You choose not to accept the reality of your plank, your fault, your sin. You go around pointing out everybody else's faults. And when it says in verse 3, why do you look at the speck of sawdust? The word look there carries the meaning a serious, continuous meditation. The thought of that look of someone else's eye, the idea is that you continue to dwell on someone else's sin while paying no attention to your own sin. That's what Jesus is getting at in the use of this hyperbole. We have 20/20 vision. I can see everybody else's faults very clearly. Little Jimmy was showing a picture of his kindergarten class to his grandmother. He was going down through the list of all the people in his class, and he began describing some of his classmates. He said, "This is Johnny right here, and you know Johnny, he hits everybody. And this is Susie right here, and she never listens to the teacher. And this is Arthur over here. He's always getting into trouble." And he goes down the line. He points out something wrong with every single person in the picture. He gets to his own picture, and he says to his grandmother, he said, "This is me. I'm just sitting here minding my own business." No, you're not. No, you're not. Isn't it amazing how clearly we can see the faults in others? We look for what is wrong and we see the worst in others. Are you a speckologist? Do you know what a speckologist is? It's always looking to find fault with everything and everyone. Does that describe you? Because if that describes you, let me tell you something. You probably already know this. It's going to control your life. You're going to be miserable. I mean, you feel like it's your calling to be a speck remover? That your calling to kind of straighten everyone else out? You need to stop being the speck police. It only leaves you lonely and shallow and rigid and passionless, and you stop growing. You stop growing. Do you have a speck list? I mean, is your parenting about picking at the specks of your kids? Husbands, do you have a list of specks that you focus on that your wife needs to work on? You've got it all figured out? Wives, you keep reminding your husband of his specks? Do you have a speck list of what is wrong with others in this church? You talk about it on the way home. How about your unbelieving friends or your neighbors or your coworkers, your family, your classmates? Are you constantly pointing out the specks in others? Because the purpose of mentioning the log is to get us to slow down before rushing to point others wrong. Slow down and examine ourselves. Slow down to what our motive is in going to the other person. Here's a rule of thumb. If you can't wait to go tell another person about his speck, you better wait. If you can't wait to go tell him, you better wait. It's a rule of thumb. Doesn't mean you never go do it, but you better first examine yourself. Remove the log. Because if we want to really help others in the Christian community, we need to take our log out first. Be aware of our own need of grace. Remove the plank. Examine ourselves. Because removing the plank then puts us in a position to help others. It's only then that we can see this person as a fellow brother, see her as a fellow sister. We're then better able to help him or her. See, only as we see ourselves as a fellow struggler can we then see how to really help someone else and how we can be a part of the solution, the rebuilding, the reconstruction. See, the whole point of the plank and the speck illustration is to show us that when we judge others as some superior saint, it blinds us from seeing a better way to really help that person. How is some plank blinding you to the reality of a situation? A young couple moved into a new neighborhood. The next morning, while they're eating breakfast, the young woman notices her neighbor hanging the wash outside. And she quickly says, well, that laundry's not very clean. She doesn't know how to wash correctly. Maybe she needs better laundry soap. What's her problem? Her husband just looked on but remained silent. And it happened repeatedly. Every time her neighbor would hang her wash to dry, the young woman would make the same comments. What's her problem? Why is her laundry so dirty that she puts up there? And a month goes by. The woman was surprised to see one morning, as she looked out, a nice clean wash on the line. She says smugly and self-righteously, well, she's finally cleaned her laundry. Finally, she's learned how to wash correctly. And the husband replies, well, actually, I got up early this morning and cleaned our windows. Isn't that how it works? Think about this. We're judging others through dirty lenses. Jesus forcefully says, stop doing that. It's hypocrisy. Do some spiritual cleaning in our own hearts. Take the plank out of our own eye. See, how can we be of help to each other at EBC? How can we be of help to each other in our community groups? See your own need of grace. Come across as a fellow struggler. Be self-aware of your own shortcomings. Take the plank out first, then remove the speck. Jesus ends this section with some interesting illustrations. We come to our last heading, a lesson from dogs and pigs. A lesson from dogs and pigs. Now we come to verse 6. Now at first pass, this verse may seem a little out of place with what Jesus has been talking about. Many believe that this verse is not related to what Jesus had just said. Oh, it's very connected. Follow along and read verse 6. He says, do not give dogs what is sacred. Now, just for a moment here, we just don't think of your cute little puppy at home, okay? Don't think of this household pet, but rather a half-wild mongrels that were scavengers in the streets. That's what's meant by dogs. They were dirty, dangerous, and despised. It'd be unthinkable for a Jew to have thrown to those dogs a piece of holy meat. Well, I'll continue with the verse, verse 6. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Now, just as the reference here is to wild dogs, we're to think of pigs in the same way. Don't think of a nice, friendly pig like in Charlotte's Web. Don't think of that pig. These pigs that Jesus is talking about, they could hurt you. See the picture, if I have this right, is of a man approaching a pack of wild, vicious dogs or some wild pigs, and they hungrily stare at him. And he throws them some precious pearls. The animals then pounce on the pearls. They start to gulp those pearls down. They soon discover they're difficult to chew, and they spit out the tasteless treat. And then enraged, they turn on the man who fed them those pearls, and they tear him to pieces. That's what it's saying. Just like you might find warning signs in the deep woods to not feed the bears. See, because once the bears get tired of your food, they're going to choose you for their next meal. What's Jesus' point? How does it complete Jesus' thought in the first 5 verses? Well, one writer suggested the thought here is that just as pigs cannot digest pearls, neither can we digest being judged and condemned. That's possible. That's possible. I think we're overthinking that a little bit with that explanation. Because at face value, I believe Jesus is addressing the danger of being indiscriminating. Citizens of heaven should not be judgmental, But citizens of heaven should use discretion also. See, there's a place to judge where a person is at and are not interested, perhaps, in hearing the truth. Because some people can't handle the truth. Some are not ready to hear the precious word of God, and they just want to argue with you. Wisdom and discernment would suggest that you stop trying to shove the truth down their throats. Now, this doesn't mean, by the way, we go around and label people as dogs and pigs. It doesn't suggest at all that we ought to be vindictive and nasty to those who don't want to hear the truth. But do judge the situation and recognize that this isn't the moment for giving them pearls of wisdom, how truthful it might be. Use discretion. That's the lesson of the pigs and the dogs. Now notice here, we have 5 verses on not being judgmental and 1 verse on using discretion. Where does the greater danger lie? Of planks, specks, pigs, and pearls. Let's learn to live without judging others, without being judgmental. Let's ask, what's the plank in my own eye causing spiritual blindness? Let's stop and ask the question, do I have all the information? Because might there be an explanation behind what we see? Can we all learn? I know I can. We can all learn to be maybe a little more understanding of what might be behind the situation, behind what the person's going through. A young boy walked past a sign that said, "Puppies for sale." So he walked into the kennel and he asked how much the puppies were going to cost. The owner replied, well, they were good dogs and he wouldn't let any of the dogs go for less than $75. The boy was disappointed. He said, well, I only have $2.37. Well, can I look at the dogs anyway? Look at the puppies. Well, the man whistled and called Lady, and out of the kennel and down the runway came Lady, followed by 4 little balls of fur. They were the cutest things. And behind the 4 little balls there, the cute little dogs, the cute little puppies, there was one lagging considerably behind. And the boy spotted that one that was lagging behind, the laggard, and he pointed to him and he asked, what's wrong with that one? The owner told the boy how there was no hip socket in the right hip and that the dog would always be lame. The boy quickly said, well, that's the one I want to buy. I want him. And he put his $2.37 down on the counter and he says, I'll give you 50 cents a month till I get him paid for. And the man smiled and he shook his head. You don't understand. That's not the dog you want. That dog will never be able to run and jump and play with you. Well, the little boy went over to the man. He pulled up his right pant leg and he revealed this brace that was running down both sides of his badly twisted right leg. And under the foot there was this leather cap that was over his knee. Mister, he said, I don't run so well myself. And he's going to need somebody that understands him. Let's learn to live without judging others. What we need more of is the desire to understand. To understand. Is there someone you're trying to fix? Is there someone you've dropped a bomb on and then walked off? Is there someone you need to ask for forgiveness because you've criticized unfairly? Is there someone you need to make things right with because your approach was not helpful, your attitude was not right, and you judge them not as a fellow struggler wanting to help? Church, we need to live in the reality of the gospel. Live in the reality that we are all in constant need of His grace. Jesus stood in for you to take God's judgment on sin. That's what we remembered this morning. Took the judgment on Himself. Let's learn to live without judging others, because Jesus says clearly, stop being judgmental. Stop being judgmental. Let's not be known for that. Let's be known for our love instead. Not wishy-washy love, but true biblical love.